Then she did me, which was very kind of her. This was when I was at the height of my prowess in the business school. And you can see, it's all me at work. This is me pontificating, this is me trying to think, this is me writing, and this is me asking, for God's sake, give me a coffee or some food. In other words, it's all about me and my work. You might assume, looking at those two pictures, that perhaps our marriage wasn't going too well. And you would be right. Because what was happening was that I had become an independent writer, broadcaster, etc., carry with. Unfortunately, I'm not very good at money, in spite of helping to start a business school, and negotiating fees and all that sort of stuff. So I've been rushing around trying to work on conferences and workshops in companies, things like that, but I always forget to charge them any money. I mean, I grew up in a rectory and money was not the sort of thing you asked for. So Elizabeth took over and started running my life, my business life anyway, quite successfully. Became my agent, my publicity agent, my literary agent, my lecture agent, everything. And it was fantastic. But then she came to me eventually, after these photographs, and she said, well, it's all very well. Your life is going very well, she said, thanks to me. But my life is being squeezed out. I've just got a degree in photography, part-time, 1 day a week. And now I want to be a photographer. I want to be a professional portrait photographer, and I have no time at all to do that. Your wretched life may be paying for our living costs, but it is squeezing me out of existence. So we had to rethink our implicit psychological contract with each other, which we did over time. So for instance, we then agreed that I would only do public occasions, I would only commit myself to meeting other people, to doing any kind of lectures or anything in the winter months, which was bad for photography because she likes to use natural light. But in the summer months, she would have first call in the diary, and I would concentrate on research and writing at home. I wouldn't go out anywhere. And where possible, I would help her, which basically meant climbing up trees with an umbrella to shade her from the sun or whatever, and carrying around some of her equipment. Furthermore, we said, we'll split the cooking and the housekeeping. 6 months of the year me, 6 months of the year her. And actually, it worked. It meant, of course, that we didn't earn as much money as we could if I'd worked full time, because most of the money still came from me. But it preserved the marriage. In other words, we renegotiated the implicit contract. Now, the same thing happens, of course, with businesses. People need to renegotiate the business. There was a disturbing statistic from a survey in France that I discovered about 3 months ago. It said that on this survey of thousands of employees, that only 11% of them were fully engaged and felt that their work was making an active contribution to the organization and that they were valued. 60% of them, as one CEO said, just turned up to go home. In other words, it's just something they had to do in the day. It wasn't at all important to them. They weren't in any way engaged. And actually 19% of them were actively disengaged and would be prepared to sabotage the firm if they got found out. This, of course, is France. Britain is better. A recent survey, only 5% were disengaged and prepared to sabotage the firm. But 60% again were just turning up to go home. It didn't matter one way or the other. But on the other hand, something like 35% were fully committed. So, better to work in England if marginally. But for most people, work is a bore. And most people of that 60% feel that their talents are not being used, that their capabilities are underrated, not being exploited. And isn't it a waste? And it's the waste partly with their own fault because they haven't told anybody what their talents are. They haven't put themselves forward. And they should renegotiate the contract. Nothing to do with money. It's just, couldn't I do more? You know? And managers ought to listen to them. And managers remember that it's a terrible word. Nobody likes to be managed. I mean, if you go into professional firms, it's very interesting. Professional firms, of course, have very, valuable people in them. And the title manager only is applied to those people who are looking after physical attributes. The catering manager, the transport manager, the building manager, but never the people managers. They're called something else. They're called coordinators or project leaders or team leaders or this sort of thing. It's only in, I think, retrograde organizations that manager is a title applied to people in charge of people. You may not mind being a manager, but I think you would hate to be managed. And I think we've got to rethink the way we actually relate, to use that word, in organizations. Because if you go home and the whole of work has been a bore, I'm afraid you're not going to be a very exciting person at home, probably. On the other hand, if you're too excited at work, then you're probably a bore at home. So you can't be. So you've got to pace your life. Furthermore, I would say to the organization people here, look, you're working people too hard. I read company reports and they say people are our greatest assets. Well, that's better than saying people are our most valuable costs, because costs are things to be reduced. But the trouble is, assets are things to be worked as hard as you can. Please, could you treat your people as talents? Because talents have to be nurtured, watered, fertilized, and given space. If you want people to be creative, you have to give them time to be creative in. Most people, if you ask them how much time they're given to think creatively without any pressure in an organization, tend to say, well, about 10 minutes at any one time before something happens, or they have to go to a meeting or the phone rings or whatever. Please give your talents room to grow and space to grow. And if that means, for instance, letting them go away from work, for instance, somebody has got to be at the nativity play. Somebody's got to be at home when the kid is sick. It doesn't have to be the woman. It could be the man. But it must be okay for them to do that. Nothing is vital in the organization, really. They can't wait for another couple of hours. I always find it quite extraordinary that, people on the whole don't go to work on Sundays unless they're in hospitals or airlines or these continuous organizations. But sort of life goes on. So why do they have to be there at 4:30 on a Wednesday afternoon when their kid is sick? They don't have to. We can be much more relaxed. And if we actually rewarded people by the results they produced, rather by the time they spent in the office, people will actually be much more productive. I'm afraid there's this terrible culture of presencing. We need to know you're working. And I think we've got to be much more creative about how we actually think about it and how creative people actually work. And if you think of all of your people as being creative and give them the room to be creative, it would be very nice and very useful. It might actually produce nicer people at home. Now, as I said, think about the relationship at work. This is another person that we photographed in the same way, and we asked him to act out his roles in life. And he was at that time an investment banker. And the investment banker role is portrayed by him in the dark suit. which you will see he's positioned himself with his back to the camera and as far away from the camera as he possibly can. We never showed this to his employer. His employer was here. He was also a very talented amateur musician, but what was totally surprised us, and we didn't know it at the time, but his passion in life actually was to be a writer of thrillers. And he's already written 2 at that time in his holidays. One of them was a bestseller. And if I showed this picture to his employer, they would be shocked, because they would, think we can't employ this guy, he's not committed. And in fact, of course, within a year he'd left the bank and devoted himself to trying to write a few more thrillers and turn them into films. But I suspected if we hadn't taken that photograph, he wouldn't have done that, because he wouldn't have realized, actually, how meaningless his work was to him, and how what was secretly his desire was being unfulfilled. And so I would encourage you to sort of do a mental photographic image of these things sometimes, and encourage your other people to do it, so that they might see what is really important to them in life. And maybe before it's too late, they can do something about it. Because so often we postpone it for too long. I met this 93-year-old the other day, and I said, what's your life been like? He said, well, when the war broke out, and I was 18 or something, and I volunteered, and they said I wasn't fit enough to join the army, but I should go to one of the reserved occupations. And they offered me 2 factories to go to. One was in the south of the River Thames, and one was the north of the River Thames. And because I lived in the north, I went to the north of the River Thames, and I stayed there for 40 years, and I got slightly promoted. And then I retired, and then I came to live in Norfolk, where we were. And he said, that's it, he said. Sometimes I think I should have done something with my life. And that's awful. And I he's awful. He was probably an awful bore at home as well. You've got to get the mixed right. The contract with yourself, the contract with your employer, the contract with your wife. And I'm talking about Chinese contracts, the sort of things that are understood by both sides, but don't need legal things. Now, in order to get the contracts right and to get your creativity sorted out, I do believe that you need a place and a time to do it in. This is a tea room in a London house of a friend of ours. Now, I'm not suggesting that you all have to have tea rooms, but I do think you need a space to be alone, actually, from time to time, to think. And it may be a room in your house. It may be a local chapel or church or one of these sort of slightly mystical places. It may be nature, it may be a wood. And wouldn't it be nice if the organization that you worked in had a sort of tea room where you could retire to if you needed to and just be quiet, without any pressure, with nobody to talk to, and nobody, and no iPhones or Twitter feeds or anything coming in. There was a time, actually, in Italy, when every farm had a chapel in the farm. And you can still find them around the place. We had a place in Italy. And every old farmstead had a chapel where people would go to at the end of the day if they wanted to. And I think it's not a bad idea. It doesn't have to be a religious thing, it's a tea room. A place of quiet meditation. And some people, of course, don't need it. They meditate without that, and any form of meditation is useful, I think. But to be alone and to be with yourself is terribly important in this hectic, frenetic life that we have.